Thanks, Bob. I'm excited to be here this evening. My name is Ashley Adair. I'm the Extension Organic Agriculture Specialist here at Purdue. I am based out of the Horticulture and Landscape Architecture Department, and I'm housed on campus in the Horticulture building. So my role is to help anybody in the state of Indiana with organic questions, whether they're growing row crops or vegetable crops or even ornamentals and everything in between. So for tonight's presentation, we're going to talk about what you can do about plant disease in organic systems. If you do have questions, I'll follow Bob's protocol there and ask you to put your questions into the chat so we can address those at the end of the presentation. I will fully admit that I am not a plant pathologist by training. So if you have questions about specific plant diseases, I can find the answer for you, but I might not have it immediately for you this evening. But we'll do our best with the time that we have. I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen. And hopefully everyone will see my presentation slide.
Yep, you're good.
All right, thanks, Bob. I appreciate the confirmation there. Without further ado, we will jump right into tonight's presentation. We'll probably take 45 to 50 minutes and have about 10 minutes at the end for questions. All right, so I'm sure that many of you have seen this before. I don't know if any of you have participated in the Master Gardener training program or if you've seen the infamous disease triangle in other parts of your life. But I wanted to start off this evening by just laying the foundation here for plant disease and what we're looking to do when we're trying to prevent or mitigate plant disease. So what we see here, this is actually a grape bunch that is suffering from black rot in the background of this triangle. The plant disease triangle describes three major components that come together to make a disease happen in an organism, whether it's a plant or really, you or I could also be subject to the same forces that cause disease. So you could call this a human disease triangle, an animal disease triangle, or a plant disease triangle. So we're going to focus on plants this evening. So we'll call it plant disease triangle this time. The disease can only happen if all three legs of the triangle come together. So to define what those legs are, we have the host, which is the organism that is affected by disease or the organism that is susceptible to disease. So in this case, it's this grape plant that is susceptible to the disease. There's also the pathogen. So that's the disease itself or the disease causing organism. So that can be a bacteria, a virus, a fungus, and sometimes some different organisms that kind of fall in between each of those types of organisms. And then finally, we have the environment. A favorable environment is required for a pathogen to be able to infect a host. So we're thinking things like humid conditions, which are often favorable to fungi. Also, warm conditions can be favorable for disease. So some things that you've probably thought about in the past in your garden or at your farm are kind of fall into this environment category. So if all of these three things come together, that means that the host gets infected with the pathogen, and then now you have disease. So let's keep that in mind as we move forward. What we're trying to do with mitigating plant disease in an organic system or a conventional system is trying to break up this plant disease triangle. We're either trying to remove the host, remove the pathogen, or make the environment less favorable for the disease to occur. So how are diseases managed in organic agriculture specifically? So in organic agriculture, we have a few less tools in our toolbox. We don't have the advantage of being able to use conventional fungicides and conventional bactericides and other types of conventional pesticides that can help manage disease. So we have to focus more heavily on some of the other tools that we have at our disposal. So that includes prevention mechanisms. So it's kind of what we're representing with the blue cancel symbol on the top left. We're trying to figure out ways to prevent the disease from coming onto the farm or from infecting our plants to begin with. On the top right, we have a symbol that's going to represent crop rotation this evening. So crop rotation is one of the honestly central principles of organic agriculture in general, but making sure that we have diverse plant species on the farm or in the garden whether that's vegetables, fruits, or even cover crop species or native plants. Having a crop rotation in place can help make sure that no one disease takes hold at any one particular time. On the bottom right, you'll see different tools that are used for sanitation. So sanitation is just as important in organic agriculture as it is in conventional, and many of the same sanitation products can be used to clean our tools and to clean our equipment and make sure that we're processing our fruits and vegetables that we've harvested in a safe manner. And then finally, on the bottom left, we do have lots of different types of inputs that we can use in organic agriculture. So the goal here is not to just substitute organic products, organic fungicides, organic pesticides for what we use in conventional. The goal is to use as few of these products as possible and only to use them as rescue treatments from a particular disease problem. And I will say here too, we're really focusing on plant disease in this evening's presentation, but some of these principles also apply to managing things like weeds or insects in organic systems. And sometimes weeds and insects will interact to help proliferate plant disease on an organic farm or in an organic garden. But we're really focusing on the plant disease component this evening. So if you do have specific questions about insects or weeds, I'm happy to try to answer those for you, but I'll just say right now that we're not going to cover those in near as great of detail as we do plant disease. But before we even get to all of that, I want to share a little bit of history with you to help you understand why organic agriculture and the regulations that we have in organic agriculture look the way they do today in 2022. So we're going to start around the turn of the century and work our way through about 100 years of history and talk about why the National Organic Program has set out the rules that it has laid out for us in the USDA organic standard. So I do get kind of excited about this part. It is fun to share historic imagery, especially from within the state of Indiana when talking about this subject. So here in this image, this is an image from Miami County. This is a set of families in a farming community that are involved in a small grain threshing operation. So what you see in this image is a mixture of animal power and mechanical power, as well as human power, that are all coming together to make this threshing operation possible. So you can see different types of equipment. So this is when belt driven and other types of equipment with different types of fuel than we were used to using in the past are becoming available to use for some kind of complex machinery. But there's still horses being used to move that equipment around, to haul straw out of the area once they're creating the straw and separating that from the grain itself. So there's kind of an interesting dichotomy here, but a mixture of things that are going on that are making agriculture possible at this time. And this is kind of really where the rise of modern agriculture starts to begin. This is a time period shortly before the advent of the Haber-Bosch process, which, if you're familiar with how fertilizer, conventional fertilizer, is made, that's the process that converts natural gas into ammonia. Now, this process was originally used for manufacturing explosives during World War I and World War II, but after the conclusion of those conflicts, the U.S. government and farmers decided that they wanted those munitions plants to continue to make these products, because that product can be used as a very quick release fertilizer for the production of a ton of grains that we're going to need for, the baby boom and everything that happened after the world wars. So this process, the Haber-Bosch process, really becomes integral to modern agriculture by the time we get to the middle of the century. But before we get there, there's a few people to talk about. This is kind of covering the time period between the 1920s and the 1940s with this group of four folks here. Organic agriculture as a movement really started to bubble up in Europe right around the 1920s. So in the top left, this man is Rudolf Steiner. And Rudolf Steiner was credited with giving a series of lectures in Central Europe that's called The Spiritual Foundations for the Renewal of Agriculture. He described how farms should be viewed more like a self-contained organism rather than a factory that's turning inputs into outputs. So these were considered the first formal educational programs on organic agriculture. And this set of lectures eventually led to the formation of what we know today as the Demeter Certified Biodynamic Standard. So the biodynamic standard is really centering low input and closed loop systems at the center of its farming standard. And they're really driving at the concept of deriving as many inputs used on your farm from the farm. So these farms that are certified biodynamic integrate livestock with cropping systems and cover cropping and try to get as much of what the farm needs from the farm itself. It also typically includes a natural system like a natural habitat for wildlife on the farm as well. There's some other stuff with biodynamic that is very much based in spiritual tradition, and we can talk a little bit about what that means if you're interested in learning more about that or if you have questions about that, but we're not going to focus on that for the majority of our presentation today. I'm going to move on to talk about the gentleman in the top right, that is Sir Albert Howard. He was a Brit that published the work called An Agricultural Testament in the 1940s. This is one of the first, quote, modern publications that suggested that soil fertility should be maintained through the ages and that we should look to nature for methods on how to maintain soil fertility. He discusses concepts that we're becoming more familiar with in a scientific way today, like humus and mycorrhizal fungi and the importance of soil water and how soil water affects relationships within the soil. So he was an agricultural advisor to the government of India at the time that Great Britain was occupying India. So he published this work shortly before India gained independence from Britain in 1947. But during the time that he was in India, Sir Albert Howard learned from Indians how to make compost, and Howard kind of translated what he learned about making compost for all of Europe and the Western world, essentially. So he's sometimes credited as being the father of compost, but really he was extending the work that Indians had been doing for many, many years and showing people of the Western world what composting could do for a farm and a garden. Then on the bottom left here, we have the lady Eve Balfour, another Brit. She published the work, The Living Soil, in 1943. So Lady Balfour is important. She was one of the first women to study agriculture at an English university, and she was also the founder and first president of the Soil Association in England, so an organization that still exists today and promotes soil health in Western Europe. So Lady Eve Balfour ran the Hawley experiment. So this was the first comparison of chemical farming methods with organic farming methods. And goodness gracious. And she described how the chemical farming methods and organic farming methods can promote soil health over time. She promoted the idea that the way that we treat our soil is reflected in the quality of our food and our health. And kind of staying on this health kick, on the bottom right, we have J.I. Rodale, who was not a scientist by training, but was a publisher by training. And he published a variety of periodicals during his time, a couple of which still exist today. So if you've heard of Men's Health or Prevention, those are two periodicals that he got started in his career. So in the 1950s, he began publishing the work, or the periodical, Organic Gardening and Farming. So this kind of started interest in organic agriculture here in the United States. So we talked about three people who were involved with the organic movement in Europe first, and now we're finally talking about somebody who is bringing some of those concepts to at least the eastern part of the United States. J.I. Rodale bought a farm in Emmaus, Pennsylvania, and that farm still exists today as the headquarters of the Rodale Institute, which is now an organization that conducts research on organic farming, as well as has an arm of the organization that does consulting with organic farmers across the country, and they're expanding that operation. And they do have public events where people can come out and see what they're doing in various parts of the country. They even have a Rodale Institute satellite organization set up in Iowa. That's the closest, probably the closest one to us. We're kind of halfway between where the Rodale Institute in Pennsylvania and Iowa are located. Rodale is kind of an interesting figure. There's a little bit of quackery mixed in with his legacy of promoting organic as a method and promoting organic research. So we can talk a little bit about him if you like. There's some interesting stories about him, but we do have plenty of other things to talk about this evening. And there's lots of other figures within the organic movement as well. George Washington Carver of the Tuskegee Institute was of Tuskegee University. He was another proponent of organic methods in the Southeast. So representing not only the Black community and the Black community of farmers, but practices that were applicable in the Southeast based on crops that could be grown. And obviously he is known as a technological innovator in the world of peanuts, but he was also a proponent of using legumes and crop rotation and limiting synthetic inputs on farms. So lots of people to potentially talk about in the organic movement. But let's get on with some of the history here. So we're back in Indiana. We're looking at Sunset Hill Farm in Porter County, Indiana in the 1940s. This is Pete Hanrahan, and he is using a spring tooth harrow to prepare the field. So this is just a great example of the advent of mechanization in agriculture. So only 40 years earlier, there was still plenty of horsepower being used on farms, and we're slowly transitioning into farms that are almost entirely powered by tractor agriculture. And implements are changing, and there's new innovations in different types of tools that tractors can use on the farm. Fast forward about 3 decades into the 1970s. This is when the environmental movement is taking place. This is a photo from an Iowa farm owned by Clarence Van Sant, and he was a pioneer of growing organic soybeans at his central Iowa farm. So what's going on right now? The environmental movement is going on, and there's a lot of farmers around the country that are looking to adopt or really re-adopt organic farming methods. The term organic, however, didn't really mean the same thing across the country. It was really left up to the farmer and the individual certifier's interpretation. So there seemed to be a general consensus that the philosophy behind organic farming, meaning things like avoiding pesticides, avoiding synthetic fertilizer, and adopting more soil-friendly production methods, was common across most organic farms. But the nuances of things were different from place to place. So there wasn't a lot of consistency from state to state or certifying agency to certifying agency. And one person's organic in Iowa might look very different from another person's organic in New England. So over the following 20 years, Congress recognized a need for developing an organic standard, and they passed the Organic Foods Production Act in 1990. So this act set into motion a development process for national standards for organic agriculture across the entire industry. And it essentially handed off the regulatory responsibility to the USDA and created the National Organic Standards Board. So another 12 years go by, and then we finally get the National Organic Program and its final rule. So this final rule, the overarching theme in the federal code here, is organic production is a production system that responds to site-specific conditions by integrating cultural, biological, and mechanical practices that foster the cycling of resources, promote ecological balance, and conserve biological diversity. So this is really the overarching theme of the federal code. This document, the National Organic Program's federal code, is a living document, and it does change. There was actually a clarifying rule passed just in the last couple of weeks about how dairy animals can be classified as organic. So there's things that are changing about this rule all the time, and it applies to crop production as well as livestock production. So there's a lot to consider in terms of inputs and allowable practices and a methodology that gets kind of wrapped up in this rule. So practically, what does that mean for somebody that's producing crops? So I should say, so if you're an organic gardener and you are making less than $5,000 a year on sales from your agricultural products, you are exempt from the inspection process and from the certification process, but you're still supposed to technically be following these rules, but no one is going to come to your farm and say that what you're doing is against USDA organic, because you're not making enough money for it to be worth it for them to inspect you, essentially. And it's all third-party certifiers that are doing this work anyway. So it's not like the federal government is going to have anything to do with this process. So I did just want to mention there's a $5,000 annual limit in sales that would require you to actually seek out certification with a third-party accredited certifier. But these are all the practices that fall under the crop production standards that the National Organic Program has set out. One of the biggest ones is that no prohibited substances can be used on that particular site for at least 3 years before the harvest of an organic crop. So there's a 3-year transition period that you must go through where no prohibited materials of any kind are used on the farm. Also, no materials, and really this is kind of looking at seed in particular, may be produced through genetic engineering methods. And there's no use of ionizing radiation for sanitizing, but you can use sanitizing products like bleach to sanitize tools and equipment. You can use ozone. So there's a few things that you might not expect to see in some of the washing and packing process. There's also no use of sewage sludge. So that's basically human and other products derived from the sewage system and from wastewater treatment. We cannot use that for fertilizer in organic. Also, organic seed is the preferred seed to use, but if there's no organic seed available and you can document that there was no organic seed available, then you can use a conventional seed option as long as there is no seed treatment used on that seed. Now, there's biological seed treatments that are approved for use in organic, but it can't be, if you've ever seen a conventional corn seed or soybean seed that has a bright green or a bright red coating on it that usually contains some type of antifungal or insecticidal property. Those types of products cannot be used in organic. And then finally, pests, weeds, and disease have to be managed through physical, mechanical, and/or biological controls. So we're looking at a really holistic and integrated pest management method of controlling all of the things that might make it hard for us to grow crops. So how does this relate to plant disease exactly? So I want to talk about some of the synthetic substances that are actually allowed for crop production. USDA organic, it stands by the concept of not using synthetic products in organic agriculture, but or not using conventional products in organic agriculture, but there's several different synthetic substances that would be, frankly, quite silly not to be able to use, because they're things that keep us as humans healthy. They keep our food safe, and they allow us to keep our tools and our equipment clean so that we're not taking disease from one plant on the farm and transmitting it to another one with our pruning shears, or transmitting disease on our harvesting equipment and our processing equipment. So some of those substances include alcohols, chlorine compounds, which is just a way of essentially saying bleach, copper sulfate. So some of the heavy metal types of products that we can use as fungicides. Also hydrogen peroxide, which is used as a sanitizing agent. And then there's some soap-based herbicides that could potentially be used in certain specific situations, which is typically for right-of-ways and then ornamental crop production only. Newspaper, which is ostensibly a synthetic product, can be used in compost with some restrictions on the ink type that's used. I think soybean-based inks are preferred over something that is a petroleum-based ink. There's also horticultural oils that can be used for a variety of pest control purposes, and then also the use of micronutrients. So if your crops have a demonstrated nutrient deficiency, then you can apply micronutrients in reasonable quantities to that particular crop if you can document that it's actually needed. If you want to view any more of these National Organic Program standards, the website is available to you, the Federal Code of Regulations website, so ecfr.gov, and then Part 205 is the USDA organic standard. So there's plenty of reading in there, and I do recommend that folks take a good look at that if they're considering producing anything in organic agriculture. So I want you to kind of hold this thought about these synthetic substances that are allowed for crop production in organic agriculture and allowed for sanitation. But I also, we gotta walk back here and look at our toolbox again and talk a little bit more in detail about what each of these different tools that we do have access to can allow us to do with organic disease management. So let's talk about basic prevention first. So planting plants in places where plants will be healthiest. That's probably the number one recommendation here. That means establishing beds that are in full sun and have good airflow. It means making sure that soils have enough organic matter and nutritional components to feed plants and keep them as healthy as possible. Like that helps boost their defenses against various different types of plant disease and insects and competition and that type of thing. We also want to make sure we're purchasing disease-free stock at all times if it is possible. So it's not always possible to purchase guaranteed disease-free seed. That involves a lot of testing, and sometimes testing single lots of seed are not really going to give you the full picture of whether that seed might be contaminated or not with a particular plant pathogen. But for example, when you purchase seed potatoes, those potatoes are often certified as disease-free because there's a testing process that the producer can send those seed potatoes off to a third party. You can send off lots to help make sure that the majority of the potatoes coming from the seed potato producer are not going to be filled with disease. So it's limiting the risk. It's not reducing the risk to zero that you'll see plant disease, but it is reducing the risk quite a bit. And then there's also seed sanitation techniques that are often very useful to undertake if you're concerned about plant disease on the farm. That can include bleach disinfection and hot water soaking. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. So I just wanted to show some examples here. This is the Purdue student farm. It's located just north of Purdue's campus proper off of Cherry Lane. This is a good example of planting plants in a full sun, high airflow environment. If any of you have visited the student farm in the past or even visited Purdue's campus, you know it's very windy here, especially, really all year round. There's no one time where it's any less windy than another time. So these beds are oriented east-west. They get good airflow. There's also a really robust crop rotation on the farm, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But just showing an example of plants planted in a place where they're going to be healthiest. And also, you want to make sure that you're soil testing. We do recommend soil testing every few years or so. You may consider doing that more frequently if you're just starting out a farm and you're not sure what your baseline is and you want to see kind of how your soil performs nutritionally for the plants that you're wanting to grow. You can send that soil test off to one of our regional soil testing labs, not a Purdue lab. We don't do that at Purdue's campus anymore, but there's options like Midwest Labs and A&L Great Lakes. Your local extension educator can help you determine where to send a soil test and help you interpret those results. Same thing with plant tissue samples. Plant tissue samples can either be sent to A&L Great Lakes or Midwest Labs or any of those types of laboratories, or you can send a sample off to Purdue for a disease analysis in case you're concerned. If you don't know whether it's a nutrient deficiency or a plant disease, the Purdue Pest and Diagnostic Lab can help you figure that out. So talking a little bit more about seed sanitizing. So you can use a bleach solution and there's instructions for how to do that. But I wanted to touch on the hot water sanitation because this one's a little bit easier and safer to do. It can be done at home on the stove with a stock pot, or if for some reason you are a little bit more scientific and happen to have a hot water bath that's of laboratory quality at home, you could use that too. So certain plant pathogens will die at certain specific temperatures. Here on the bottom of the slide, there's an eorganic.org website that you can go to find out what temperatures certain plant diseases that can infest seed coats will die at. So for example, 122 degrees Fahrenheit is a common temperature that several different plant diseases will become inactivated at. So it's a decent idea to be able to do this if you're concerned about bringing plant disease onto the farm. However, if you're going to use this method, you need to make sure that you're planting the seeds immediately afterward. You can't store them after you do this. And certain types of seeds like pelletized carrot or lettuce seed, because those seeds are, they're kind of a funky shape and they don't go through the earthway seeder very well unless they're pelletized. Those types of seed, if they're coated with anything to help pelletize them, they can also not be sanitized using this method. Same thing with certain microbial treatments that you might get. So thinking about inoculum that is designed to help bean seed get rhizobium bacteria. Those types of seed treatments can sometimes be inactivated by this process. So it's not a good idea to use any sort of heat sanitization with any seed treatments like that. So let's talk about a couple of other preventative practices that can be fairly simple to implement in the farm and garden situation. One of them, the one you see on the left, is soil solarization. So using a clear plastic tarp to solarize the soil. So you're essentially increasing the temperature of the soil to the point where some plant diseases will be killed and some weed seeds will either be weakened or killed. Sometimes you have to get the temperatures pretty high to make sure that the weed seed dies, but it can be a helpful method and a pretty simple and easy method to preparing a seed bed in the springtime. You can also use black plastic mulch or landscape fabric to help cover the soil and prevent soil from splashing up onto plants. This can particularly be an issue for plants like tomatoes that can suffer from oomycete infection, which really tends to be a problem with overhead irrigation. So we don't typically recommend overhead irrigation for tomatoes, especially if they're grown in a high tunnel situation like this. But soil-borne pathogens can still jump up and bite a lot of different types of vegetables, and keeping the soil covered up with either a plastic mulch like this, or alternatively, an organic mulch, which could be a roller crimped cover crop like cereal rye, that can help keep the plants clean, help keep the fruits clean, and help prevent the spread of disease. This particular example, this is from Purdue Ag Center. Dr. Liz Maynard was heading up this research project looking at basically a pumpkin variety trial done within a cereal rye mulch system. So this cereal rye overwintered, was terminated. This is probably in late May sometime. And after the termination step, it's all flattened out like this so that it basically provides a straw mulch for the pumpkins to grow on, and the pumpkin fruit stays clean. It stays free of disease for the most part, and the fruit quality is improved because of this type of system. So that kind of wraps up our prevention methods that we might consider on an organic farm or in an organic garden. But let's talk about crop rotation. I really think this is one of the most important concepts in managing disease as well as insect and weed pressure on an organic operation. So what we talk about with crop rotation is essentially planting different plant families of crops in a bed in succession. So from year to year, we're making sure that we're not planting tomatoes in the same spot every single time. And we're making sure that we're not planting squash in the same spot every time. What we're doing instead is planting tomatoes. And then once the tomatoes are done, maybe they're paste tomatoes and they're determinants. So you take those out of the field and you plant lettuce for the fall. Once the lettuce is done, you plant a cover crop that overwinters into the next year. And then you plant onions after you terminate that cover crop. And then after the onion year is finished, you plant a fall cover crop, let that overwinter. Then the next year you plant squash in that bed. So there's a lot of different ways that you can approach the sequencing of crop rotation. But overall, you need to make sure that you're balancing your biological needs on the farm. So soil health principles, fertility, and potential disease and pest management with business needs. So for example, I'm thinking about melon growers in the southwest part of the state. Implementing crop rotation practices is a lot more difficult for growers who are more dependent on income from a single crop than on smaller, more diversified farms who can grow a whole bunch of different things and have a diverse sales stream with all kinds of different crops. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that all the crops that you might use in a crop rotation are going to be for sale. Some of those crops might be cover crops integrated into the rotation, and other crops might be just break crops. So you might plant a lettuce in between a tomato and a cover crop. You might not expect to get a ton of yield off of that lettuce, but it could be enough maybe to make salads for you and your family, maybe not enough to take to the farmer's market. So these types of practices can help break up the disease cycle, so the life cycles of some of these different plant diseases, and it can also overall keep the pressure from these diseases down more so than if crop rotation was not implemented. So I want to share some more from the Purdue Student Farm, because the Purdue Student Farm has a 6-year crop rotation on site. This isn't necessarily prescriptive. This is just an example of something that you might consider doing on an organic farm. And I should mention the student farm is not certified organic, but they do use organic methods and organic products. So still going to use it as an example here. So let's go through their crop rotation and what we have here in this image. So here in kind of in the bottom center of the image, this is a spring crop block that is planted to greens, so salad greens and some other brassica types of crops in the springtime. And then in the fall, it's cover cropped. So this image was taken in late July, early August. And there's a summer cover crop planted in there right now. So that essentially gives this block two cover crop sequences to get through before the next year. These blocks, I should also mention, they're about 1/8 of an acre in size, if that helps give you some perspective on the size of what we're looking at. The next block, this is the solanaceous block. So solanaceous crops include peppers and tomatoes, and there's both sweet peppers and hot peppers grown in this block, and caterpillar tunnels are also used in this block. So this is an important set of species that you don't want to plant repeatedly in the same spot, because there's a lot of different diseases that can affect tomatoes and peppers and that type of thing. Up here in the top right, this is a fall greens block. So this was cover cropped in the springtime and is now planted to different species that are good for salads, like lettuces and mustards and that type of thing. This block in the yellow here is the onion block, or the allium block, because leeks and garlic are grown in there as well. This is a summer cover crop. This is a summer crop block that includes potatoes, squash, and popcorn. And finally, there is a green fallow part of the crop rotation at the student farm, where it's just continuously planted to cover crops. This whole farm site used to be a corn, soybean rotation farm. It was just farmed conventionally by a local farmer. So the organic matter on this site was less than 1.5% across most of the farm. And because of continuous cover cropping and some other practices that are used at the student farm, organic matter has increased to 3 and 4% in some of these different blocks. So cover crops can really improve soil health metrics over time. And this site has been used for about 6 years now. There's also a bunch of other stuff going on at the student farm. So it's not just the crop rotation that's out in the field. There's also high tunnels on the farm that are rotated as well. So if you're using season extension on your farm or in your garden, it's a good idea to make sure that you're rotating either within those tunnels or across all the tunnels that you have. The only tunnel that's not rotated in this system is the tunnel that has horseradish in it. That's just kind of a fun experiment that they're doing. And that high tunnel is not really, it's not really a functional tunnel anyway, because it doesn't have any end walls. So talking a little bit more about disease management using crop rotation, there are certain circumstances where crop rotation will be better for disease management than others. So it's best for diseases that tend to survive for short periods of time. So we're talking typically 1 to 2 years, maybe as many as 3 years. And that's where diseases can overwinter in crop residue or live in the soil. Crop rotation is best for diseases with a very narrow host range. So for example, bacterial spot of pepper and tomato has a pretty narrow host range. The pathogen that causes it is pretty specific to pepper and tomato. Whereas diseases like xanthomonas, which causes a whole host of different types of diseases across many different vegetables, that has a very broad host range. So that's a lot harder to control with crop rotation. Crop rotation is also best when entire fields or field units can be rotated in and out of certain crops. So thinking about the way that rainwater moves in the field and how plants planted close to each other can sometimes spread disease to each other, it's best to be able to keep these potential disease-causing units as far away from each other as possible. So taking certain blocks of your farm or garden, whether it's raised beds or something quite a bit larger, making sure that you can rotate entire areas instead of just a row within an area is going to be more effective. And I want to mention, and I have a copy of this book here, and I sent along the free PDF version of this book to Bob to distribute to all of you. This is Crop Rotation on Organic Farms, a planning manual. This book has been enormously informative in my position, in my role here on campus, and it's been extremely helpful to plenty of other researchers and farmers across the country. It has extremely comprehensive tables and other text in this book that can really help you figure out what your crop rotation sequence should look like based on the diseases you have, based on the things that you want to grow, based on your cover crops, based on even some small grains and larger grains. So there's quite a bit to learn from this particular book, and you all will have a free copy of it provided by SARE. Essentially, SARE provides all of their print resources available as PDFs for free to anyone who wants them. So I encourage you to dive into that book. So I want to share some examples of ways that crop rotation can help manage disease. So I talked a little bit about bacterial spot just now. Let's talk a little bit more about it in depth here. Bacterial spot of pepper and tomato is caused by the pathogen Xanthomonas campestris, and it's a specific pathovar, which is vesicatoria. This pathogen survives only on plant debris. So talking about things like stems and leaves, anything that might be left on the ground after a tomato harvest. So as that debris decomposes or is removed from the field, then the pathogen can no longer exist there. So the solution, if you have bacterial spot in your field, rotate away from peppers and tomatoes in this area for 1 to 2 years, and you should be pretty well set up to plant peppers and tomatoes in that spot by year 3. So that's a good example of how crop rotation to other non-susceptible species can help break up the disease cycle for these particular plants. Now, talking about black rot, which is actually caused by the same species of pathogen, the same bacteria, Xanthomonas campestris, but the pathovar is different. So notice this, that's the importance of scientific names when we're talking about really anything in the plant disease world. You have to make sure that you know exactly which pathovar we're talking about, because Xanthomonas campestris obviously infects tomatoes and peppers. We just saw that with bacterial spot, but brassicas are affected by Xanthomonas in a different way, and it's basically a different subspecies. So this pathogen is brought in on seed, and it can survive in brassica cover crops like mustards and radish, which tend to be popular for biofumigation purposes, or can be great for helping relieve soil compaction. So a lot of people do want to use those. And this pathogen can also survive in brassica weed species. So shepherd's purse is one that comes to mind in particular. So the solution here is to rotate away from brassicas, keep fields clear of any brassica weeds, and avoid brassica cover crops for at least 3 years, maybe more. I know a lot of vegetable growers who just flat out refuse to plant brassica cover crops on their farm because of the risk that Xanthomonas will become a persistent problem. So it's an issue. It can survive in the soil for 3 years or more. So this is an example of how crop rotation can help mitigate a problem, but it's still pretty difficult in an organic system to try to make sure that this disease goes away. So what are some other examples of this? What are the diseases that tend to be resistant to disease management through crop rotation? So crop rotation is not effective for disease that tends to be spread around by the wind. So especially those long distance diseases. So we think of things like powdery mildew, common rust, which actually travels on the jet stream, and things like late blight of tomato and potato. So these types of things can travel a long way on the wind. In fact, powdery mildew basically travels up the entire East Coast every year because as spring rolls around, it's planted in Florida first, then Georgia, then the Carolinas, then it makes its way all the way up to Maine. And it's basically successive plantings of cucurbits that entire time. So it's just hopping from field to field to field to field all the way up the coast. So those types of pathogens are not going to be easily controlled by crop rotation because they don't exist in the soil, they exist in the air. Some other diseases that are difficult to manage with crop rotation include fusarium wilt. So Fusarium oxysporum is the pathogen that causes fusarium wilt, and there's a bazillion different subspecies that affect a bazillion different crops. So this is one that is a real challenge to manage in an organic system once it gets on the farm, and it can survive in the soil for many years. So this is one that you might have to have a 6 or 7 year crop rotation to be able to manage this in a particular area. And then for diseases like Rhizoctonia, the pathogen Rhizoctonia solani, this particular pathogen has a very wide range of hosts and a wide variety of symptoms, which may be called damping off, bottom rot, head rot, root rot, wire stem. All of these different diseases are caused essentially by the same pathogen. And since the host range is so broad, it's hard to rotate away from one plant family and into another one that wouldn't be affected by this pathogen. So that's another example of one that would be really difficult to manage with crop rotation alone. So I should mention another component of crop rotation is making sure that the crop plants that you're putting into your farm have disease resistance characteristics. So for example, this is Milligro organic pelleted lettuce seed. And in this particular instance, this lettuce seed has resistance to downy mildew, a virus, an aphid, and a second virus. So there's a lot that this particular lettuce is resistant to. Now, that doesn't mean it won't look sick at some point or another, but it does mean that it can stand up to downy mildew or lettuce mosaic virus better than something that would not have a resistance characteristic bred into it. So I'm sure all of you have seen the disease resistance codes in various seed catalogs in the past. So make sure you're looking at those and kind of know what you might have to deal with in your garden or on your farm to help mitigate the disease pressure on your particular area. You should also be incorporating cover crops into your rotation, and in particular, small grains, because small grains, they're grasses. They don't share a lot of the same pathogens that vegetables do with each other. So grasses like cereal rye, like shown here, that's a winter cover crop, or grasses like sorghum, which is a summer cover crop, or you could even, rotate sweet corn or popcorn into your rotation. These can help break up the life cycles of diseases like root knot nematode and reduce the pathogen load for other diseases like Rhizoctonia, for example, which we talked about just now. So integrating a cover crop can be another great way to help keep your vegetable plants healthy. And I just wanted to share, this is a page out of Crop Rotation on Organic Farms. This is one of the tables that you can find that help you determine what your crop rotation plan should look like, depending on what you're wanting to grow. And it even shows the different weed species that might also be hosts of the disease. So for example, we talked about shepherd's purse being a place that Xanthomonas can take up residence while it's waiting for another brassica to infect. So in this book, you have all kinds of excellent records that are based on peer-reviewed research of different weed species that can be hosts of disease, how long your rotation away from a particular crop should be, or whether that's even applicable to the situation. Hugely beneficial resource. There's diseases of basically all kinds of crops that you would consider growing on the farm or in the garden in this particular book. So encourage you to take a look. Now let's talk about sanitation. We're coming up on about 47 minutes into the presentation. So this stuff is pretty simple. We'll talk about the importance of keeping tools clean and some of the different products you can use to keep tools clean. So keeping tools clean and sanitized is important for any garden, but particularly in organic because we have fewer tools to mitigate disease in other ways. And organic The organic program allows for various disinfectants to be used, whether that's in irrigation systems and flushing out your irrigation lines, or to sanitize your tools, or to use on post-harvest equipment in your washing and packing area. Tool sanitation is going to help prevent the spread of diseases that tend not to be soil or airborne. So we're talking about diseases that tend to affect the vascular tissue of plants. So thinking about verticillium wilt in tomato, or really any other crop that verticillium wilt can affect, which is many, many different species of plants. That tends to produce an oozy bacterial material that clogs up the ducts inside the plant. Essentially, it clogs up the phloem and the xylem inside the plant and then causes it to wilt. So if you're pruning in tomatoes, you want to make sure that you're cleaning your tools in between an area that you suspect might have disease in it versus an area that seems like it's clean. So what are some of the sanitation products that you can use? These include sodium hypochlorite, which is just another way of saying bleach, or chlorine materials, which is another way of saying bleach. Hydrogen peroxide, which is found in products like Sanidate. Peroxyacetic acid, which is found in products like Sanidate and Oxidate. There's isopropyl alcohol and ethanol that can be used for sanitization. Acetic acid, which is vinegar, can be used as long as it's derived from an organic source. So it has to be made from, like if it's apple cider vinegar, for example, it has to be made from organic apples. And then detergents, like things like dish soap that you can use to soap up your shovels and pruners and that type of thing, as long as you rinse it off right away. And that soap or any of these other sanitation products don't come into contact with any produce or plants on the farm, then it's considered good in the organic rules. And if you're planning on using any of these sanitation products on a certified organic farm, you have to make sure that you're including those products and their information in your organic system plan. So that's an important consideration to make, because your certifier will want to know what you're using and why you're using it. So a sanitation also includes field cleanup. So if you have a tomato, or if you have a pepper, or if you have potatoes that become infected with some type of disease, cleaning out the diseased plants as soon as they appear and destroying them can help prevent the spread of that disease, either across the farm in the current season or in the next season. So destroying any diseased plant material, destroying biodegradable trellising materials that have been touched by plant disease. So thinking like bamboo, trellising types of materials, disposing of materials like twine that can't be used again, and making sure that you're disinfecting more durable materials like T-posts and your irrigation lines if you're using drip irrigation. How does compost affect sanitation? This is an important consideration, because some people have backyard composts, but it might not be really up to snuff when it comes to fully killing a plant pathogen. Compost piles generally have to reach temperatures between 150 and 160 degrees Fahrenheit to really reliably kill plant pathogens. And most of the time, we're not going to recommend putting any vegetable plants that have been killed by plant pathogens into the compost to reduce the risk that those pathogens will continue to spread to other plants. So if you're composting, make sure that you're doing it so that you're bringing the temperature up to the right temperature and you're turning it once it gets to 160 degrees. It's a big management consideration. And then just make sure that you're not putting any diseased material in those compost piles. And then we have a whole host of inputs. I'll go through these relatively quickly, because this is really looked at as a last resort measure for an organic farm. We're hoping that prevention, crop rotation, and sanitation can do the majority of the work for us when it comes to preventing or mitigating plant disease. But we do have other tools at our disposal. There's a whole range of different types of products that can be used for different purposes. So for example, on this slide, we have everything from copper fungicide to double nickel. Funnily enough, double nickel is actually not a metal product. It is a biological. So these products range from metals and minerals like copper fungicides, which copper is, it disrupts metabolism in pathogens, essentially. So it denatures proteins. There's also sodium bicarbonate and other bicarbonate materials that can be used to simply prevent fungi from being able to germinate on the leaf or other surfaces of the plant. We also have oils that can be used. So neem oil and horticultural oil are two of the most common ones used in organic systems. Neem oil is used as like a three-way product, a miticide, a fungicide, and an insecticide. And the way it works is it basically prevents mites, insects, and fungi from being able to access enough of the surface of the plant leaf to actually gain purchase and infect. Same thing with horticultural oil. Cumulus, that's an example of a sulfur product. Sulfur is another thing that can disrupt metabolism in a pathogen cell. Then we have a whole host of biologicals. So this is things like BT. If you've ever used BT before for an insect, there's also biologicals, bacillus, basically bacteria that can be used to outcompete different types of fungi and bacteria. So essentially taking up space on the plant leaf and acting as a preventative measure for any of the bacteria to actually enter the plant, and not so much as an actual like a curative treatment. Most of these products are not going to be well used as a curative treatment once the plant has been infected. And then finally, we have this kind of miscellaneous category over here on the right. Oxidate and other sanitization products fall into this spot. Oxidate is basically OxyClean for plant leaves. It can sanitize a plant leaf of any bacteria that exist on it, which I'm sure you might be able to imagine that might be an issue because there's probably good bacteria and good fungi there that we might want to keep. So these products need to be used sparingly. They need to be used as rescue treatments only. We want to make sure that we're doing our best in our organic system plan to make sure that we have plenty of other fail-safes in place before we have to use any of these types of products. I should also mention in the biologicals, there is a nematicide. It's a fungus that kills root knot nematode and other types of nematodes. So there's a lot of different options available. And as more research gets done in this field, we find more and more different types of like nematode pathogenic bacteria and other types of bacteria that can help with this disease management process. So you might be wondering, how do you know if an input is really truly organic? And we have resources out there that can help you figure this out. So the products that are shown here in the previous couple of slides really only scratch the surface of what's available in the marketplace. So that's where the federal code and also OMRI, the Organic Materials Review Institute, come into play. I encourage you to go to omri.org and play around with the website. There's a search tool where you can put in any type of product. So for example, if you wanted to search for neem oil products that are certified for organic in Canada, the US, or Mexico, you can go to OMRI and figure out the different regulations for each of those products. So if you put neem oil in, you'll see organic regulations for the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and it'll tell you what each of the restrictions are for use of that product in each of those countries. So pretty fascinating stuff, actually. There's some kind of surprising things in there. So I just want to remind you that inputs are that last resort strategy, but they do make up an important component of integrated pest management strategies on organic farms. And really, your certifier, if you're working with a certifier, these folks are trying to make sure that you have the practices in place to prevent and mitigate plant disease without the use of chemical inputs. And they're trying to make sure that we're not overusing inputs and we're not just substituting organic inputs for conventional ones. So that's just really what I want to hammer home with that point. I just want to leave you, this is the disease triangle again. So we talked about a lot of different hosts and pathogens, and we talked about a few environmental conditions that affect plant disease. So I appreciate your attention and hanging with me through quite a bit of different information this evening. And if you would like to reach out to me, so if you missed part of the presentation, or if you just want to go over something in more depth, you can reach me at either my email address here or my phone number at my office. And I just want to thank you for your participation, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
So do we have any questions for Ashley this evening?
I went ahead and dropped my contact information in the chat since I stopped SlideShare. So if there's anything that you do want to ask about, please feel free to reach out to me at either of those spots. And I'll say too, we didn't talk about it in the presentation, but if any of you are curious about the manure regulations with organic agriculture, I have shared with Bob the USDA guidance on applying manure in organic agricultural systems. So whether it's raw or composted manure, there's different timeframes that you have to consider, which can help make sure that you're not going to make animals or people sick with any of the produce coming off the farm. So please feel free to ask any questions about that document as well.
And my intention is to have the recording of this out to you guys by probably mid-afternoon tomorrow, and I will include everything that Ashley has shared with me in that email. All right, I am not seeing any questions come up in chat, so I'm not going to keep you guys any longer. Ashley, thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation. And with that, I will go ahead and let everybody go. You guys have a great night and a great weekend. And thank you, Ashley.
Thank you. I appreciate it.